Hello and welcome to today's geography lesson. Today we're going to look at geomorphology again, but we're going to be more specific and we're going to look at Fluvial geomorphology. Now, if we just quickly revise, in grade 10 and 11 we also discussed geomorphology. In grade 10, very importantly, you've learned about your different types of rocks that might be present in your grade 12 syllabus as well. The different types of rocks that you've learned were sedimentary rocks, igneous rocks and metamorphic rocks. And in grade 11 we learn about our different landforms. But in grade 12 we're going to look at fluvial geomorphology, and that's regarding the landforms. The fluvial process is the movement of running water over the land, over the surface that it runs. Now, water runs on the surface in two ways: indirectly and directly, on top of the surface and below the surface. And we need to be able to distinguish between these different flow patterns. If we look at the definition, is the movement of running water directly or indirectly through the surface. So what basically happens is when the water is on top of the surface, for instance a river, or when the water infiltrates below the surface and eventually collects on the water tables and eventually flows back into the oceans. But that we will discuss in detail in our next couple of slides. If you look at the fluvial process, we've got surface runoff. Very importantly, grade 12, it's water usually in our river channels. Now, we're going to discuss the different types of rivers as well in a couple of slides' time. But by now you only know about two rivers: permanent rivers and non-perennial rivers, that we will discuss in the next couple of slides. And then groundwater is when the water infiltrates through the soil because of gravity. Now keep in mind there's factors that plays a vital role that determine if the water is going to be on top of the surface or if the water is going to infiltrate below the surface. Now we use quite a few terms: surface runoff, the water on top of the surface; groundwater flow, when the water infiltrates; direct runoff, we also refer to, is very similar to the surface runoff. It's when the water flowing over the Earth's surface in river channels. Indirect runoff is when it's base flow. Now base flow means underground and back to our oceans. So please don't get confused between the following terms when they ask these questions in your examination paper. Now, first of all, to understand this whole process, we need to go back to the basics, what you've learned in grade 10, the hydrological cycle. Now, very importantly, hydro means water. More familiar term, the water cycle. Now, very importantly, if you look at the water cycle, it's a closed cycle, this hydrological cycle. It means we can't add more water and we can't remove water from it. Now, as you know, if you look at the planet Earth, 72% of the world is covered with water, and that's mostly ocean water. Now, how does this process develop? First of all, evaporation takes place. Now, what is evaporation? It's when the liquid of the oceans, the water, are being evaporated. It's when it turns from a liquid form to a gas form. Now that happens usually during warm conditions, hot conditions, and eventually what will happen? The liquid will turn into a gas. As it moves higher in the atmosphere, what happens to that gas? It reaches dew point temperature. And what happens at dew point temperature? Condensation. Now condensation takes place, that gas turns back into water droplets. And eventually when these clouds are heavy enough, what's going to happen? We experience precipitation, rain, hail or snow. Now what happens? It rains over the interior countries, over countries, continents. What happens? This water two ways how this water reaches back to the ocean. Surface runoff, as you can see over there, it flows into our stream channels, as you can see, into our major rivers, and then obviously the river discharge into the ocean. Or another form how the water can move all the way back into the ocean is indirect runoff. When the water infiltrates, it eventually goes through to our water table and again transported through groundwater, and that's base flow back into our oceans. Now what I'm meaning is this is a closed cycle because it's repetitive, happens over and over and over. Evaporation takes place over our oceans. Our oceans covers the biggest parts of the Earth's surface. Evaporation takes place from a liquid to a gas. Condensation takes place. Cloud formation takes place. But how does this condensation take place? At dew point temperature. Cloud formation and can lead to precipitation, rain, hail, snow. It rains over the land surfaces. The water that runs on top of the surface in our river channels is surface runoff, and where the water infiltrate is known as groundwater runoff, and eventually it will be all transported back to the ocean where this whole process repeats itself. If you look at the following characteristics, like we've discussed it, the hydrological cycle, like I've mentioned before, it's the water cycle. It's the process where water is transferred from the oceans to the sky and back to the oceans, to land and back to the oceans. We discussed it, evaporation takes place, the water vapor cools down, that's where condensation takes place at dew point temperature. Okay, moisture is being released as precipitation, that's rain, and there's surface runoff or indirect runoff where it infiltrates and eventually, ultimately, it flow back into the oceans. Now, there's certain factors that plays a role. What makes water not infiltrate and what makes the water rather run on top of the surface? And it's quite a few of them. Very importantly, the amount of precipitation, amount of rain, the soil cover that you see over there, vegetation. Then another important one is the steepness of slopes, as you can see. Now, these factors are on the next page, and I want to discuss all of them in detail. The first one is precipitation. Now, that's rainfall. Now, obviously, if a place receives more rainfall, what do you think what's going to happen with the water? Is it going to be on top of the surface or below the surface? Basically, it depending on the type of rock, underlying rock. Now, very importantly, if a place receives more rainfall, the chances that it's going to be surface runoff is greater. It means that river can form. You don't see that arid, dry regions basically consist of many rivers. So if the rainfall increases, the indirect and direct runoff can increase. It means there's going to be more infiltration. It means there's going to be more water on top of the surface. Now, relief is the steepness of the slopes. For example, if it's a very steep slope and it rains a lot, do you think the water will have time to infiltrate? No. If it's a gentle slope, do you think the water will have time to infiltrate? Definitely yes. So let's say, for instance, if we look at like mountainous regions, let's say, for instance, it rains over there. What's the chances of having a river in mountainous areas? It's quite good because it's going to promote direct runoff on top of the surface. The simple reason why is because the water doesn't have enough time to infiltrate. Now, if we take a gentle slope, gentle area, what happens over there? Like a rugby field, like a recreation field. You've seen it at school. If it rains, what happens? Most of the water infiltrates. But when it rains on a very steep slope, we experience usually surface runoff. Now, a very important point over here is the permeability of rocks. The permeability of rocks is if it allows the water to infiltrate. Now we get different types of rocks, sedimentary rocks, igneous rocks and metamorphic rocks. Some rocks allow water to infiltrate. Some rocks do not allow water to infiltrate. If the rock allows for water to infiltrate, we refer to it as permeable rocks. It means it allows the water to infiltrate and it's going to promote what? Indirect runoff, groundwater runoff. When the rock does not allow the water to infiltrate, we say it's impermeable rock. It means no water can go through. So in this case, if it rains in this impermeable rock, the chances are very good, basically 100% that we're going to see surface runoff. Water on top of the surface as like a river. When the rock is permeable, it allows water to infiltrate. We're not going to see great open water surfaces. And our last point is just as valid. Vegetation cover. If an area is covered with a lot of vegetation, I'm talking plants, trees, what's going to happen? Do you think the water is going to infiltrate? Or do you think it's going to promote groundwater runoff? Or is it going to promote surface runoff? Is the water rather going to be on the surface? Definitely infiltration, because what does water do? It soaks up the water, it promotes infiltration, groundwater runoff. So if you look back at this diagram over here, you will notice where the plants are, there's going to be less surface runoff. There's less water going to be on the surface, but rather underground runoff, and will lead to base flow. Now, if we look at less vegetation over here, it's going to promote surface runoff. Now, as you can see with a steep gradient, also going to promote surface runoff. Over here with a gentle gradient, there's going to be less surface runoff. So the water is rather going to infiltrate than runoff in river channels. And lastly, our first point that we discussed is the amount of precipitation. If there's not a lot of rainfall, the chances that we're going to have surface runoff is less. If there's a lot of rainfall, the chances that we're going to have surface runoff is more. So if we look at our points, the amount of rainfall, some areas receive less rainfall, some areas receive more rainfall. The steepness of the slope, a steep slope rather going to promote surface runoff. A gentle slope is going to promote groundwater runoff. The permeability of a rock, let's just write it over here. We've got permeable, and what did we say about permeable? It allows water to infiltrate. Impermeable, it do not allow water to infiltrate. So with permeable rock, we're going to experience this over there. The water is going to infiltrate. And with impermeable rock, we're going to experience surface runoff. Vegetation cover, obviously, means more infiltration. Less vegetation cover, less surface runoff. Now, in grade 10 and grade 11, when you're introduced to map work, you've learned about rivers on a map. Now, the only two rivers that you are familiar with is a perennial river, that's a solid blue line, and a non-perennial river that was a dotted blue line that we find on our maps. Now, your teacher probably explained to you, what's a perennial river? It's a river that flows right throughout the year. And the non-perennial river, it only flows during rainy season. So when we talk about it, it's the actual water that we can see in a river. Perennial river, it means it's going to have water all year long. And a non-perennial river, it's only going to have water when it's rainy season. So that was the two rivers that you were introduced to in grade 10. But today we're going to learn a little bit more about the different rivers that we experience, and I will continue directly after the break.